Welcome to this edition of Backroad Museums, a road trip through history. Each week, we will be crisscrossing the countryside, exploring unique and interactive museums off the beaten path. This week, we'll be sky high over southern Ontario as we make another stop on Backroad Museums. In today's episode, we're in Mount Hope, Ontario, just outside Hamilton, and a little over an hour's drive from Toronto to visit the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum. You'd be wrong if you think this is just a hands-off military museum. The Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum is unlike any war or aviation museum in North America. It gives visitors a unique experience with its collection of aircraft.
Keeping history alive. I think in our case, because we are the only flying museum in Canada right now, we have the opportunity not only to show the people these beautiful aircraft on the ground, we can take them airborne and take them for flights in these things to really let them see what it's like to be in a Lancaster bomber, for instance, or a C-47 that actually dropped paratroopers and carried cargo and all the things she did during the war. And we get people coming in from all over the world to ride the Lancaster because it's one of two. We are the only ones that do flights on it. The one over in Great Britain with BB belongs to the King now, and they don't do passenger rides.
It is very successful. The Lancaster usually is sold out for the season in advance, and most of the aircraft are at capacity.
When visitors make their way into the museum's hangar, they get an up-close look at military aircraft, ranging from propeller-driven planes from the Second World War to jets of the Cold War.
So Canadian Warplane Heritage today consists of almost 50 aircraft. Approximately 20 of them are flown on a regular basis. We have a large selection of trainers, we have one fighter, we have bombers, liaison aircraft, and display galleries that go along with that as well.
In 2022, the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum celebrated its 50th anniversary. The museum has come a long way from its humble beginnings.
Well, it actually started back in the 70s, but there was no plan to build this fantastic museum that we have today. Two gentlemen, pilots out of Toronto, Alan Ness and Dennis Bradley, were looking for something a little more high performance to fly. So they started with one aircraft, and people wanted to get involved. They wanted to help, and it kind of just evolved organically from there. Over the years, the museum's had many successes and triumphs, but in 1993 we had a hangar fire that destroyed 5 historical aircraft. So we lost a Hurricane Spitfire and 3 liaison type aircraft. But in the spirit of our museum, we continued on, and in fact, that's probably one of the reasons we have this fantastic facility that we have today. We took the insurance money, we fundraised, and we worked with the government, and we were able to put this facility together as a result of the fire.
When walking through the hangar and looking at all the aircraft, one of the first questions that comes to mind is, where did the museum find all these planes?
Well, nowadays it's actually very difficult to add a new aircraft to our collection, only because the value of these aircraft have increased so significantly. A Mustang could cost you $5 million right now.
Though aircraft are harder to come by these days, the museum's newest addition to its collection is one of the most famous fighters of World War II. July 1940. Only weeks after France surrendered to Hitler, Nazi Germany began a bombing campaign against Great Britain, a prelude to an invasion. The Battle of Britain begins. Daily aerial dogfights play out over the British skies. After 17 weeks of fighting and an enormous loss of German life and aircraft, Hitler calls off plans for the invasion. The RAF and Allied air crews won the Battle of Britain. It was Hitler's first significant defeat in the war. After the Herculean effort from the RAF and Allied pilots and air crews, Prime Minister Winston Churchill summed up the nation's gratitude in a speech with the immortal words,
"Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed By so many to so few.
Of all the Allied aircraft that fought in the Battle of Britain, one became synonymous with the victory and one of the most renowned fighters of its day.
Really, when you think of iconic World War II Allied aircraft, you're thinking of the Supermarine Spitfire. So it's right up there as an iconic World War II fighter aircraft.
For the past 30 years, this Spitfire has been on loan from the Aviation Museum in Ottawa.
As a loaned aircraft, it could be displayed, but we couldn't restore it, we couldn't fly it or anything like that. And just last month, they made the decision to gift us this aircraft, which is a wonderful donation. We didn't think we'd ever have a Spitfire in our collection. And now that it's ours, we actually have plans to restore the Spitfire to flying condition. The beauty of this restoration is we have an almost complete aircraft sitting behind us. It's almost like when you find one of those car barn finds. But the first thing we're actually going to do is a fundraising campaign in the spring. But one of the things we do know for sure is the engine will be sent out to the US for a complete overhaul, and the propeller will also be overhauled. There's approximately 60 Spitfires flying in the world. In Canada, however, there's only one flying right now, so this will make the second Spitfire flying in Canada. It'll be the second place in the world that you can see a Spitfire flying with a Lancaster in the world, here and over in England where the other Lancaster flies.
Next on Backroad Museums, we look at the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum's most fierce-looking fighter bomber. Later, we take a ride on a World War II veteran. Backroad Museums is visiting the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum in Mount Hope, Ontario, 85 kilometers from downtown Toronto. At this stunning museum, visitors can get a close-up look at over 45 military aircraft. As you walk through the museum's collection, one of the fiercest-looking aircraft is the North American B-25 Mitchell bomber. This medium bomber was the type of aircraft used in one of the most daring missions in World War II.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The Empire of Japan attacked the United States Naval Base at Pearl Harbor in Honolulu, Hawaii. Over 2,300 American servicemen lost their lives. Americans are stunned by the sudden attack. President Franklin D. Roosevelt wanted immediate retaliation to boost American morale and send a message to the Japanese people. A bold plan was hatched to launch a bombing raid by using B-25 Mitchell bombers that would be launched from 2 aircraft carriers. The plan was conceived and led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle and is forever known as the Doolittle Raid. On April 18, 1942, 16 modified B-25 Mitchell bombers took off from an aircraft carrier and reached their targets over Japan. The raid was considered a success, and American morale soared when the news of the attack was made public. The Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum's B-25 was added to the collection in a very kind of mundane way.
That one, they actually just saw an ad in the newspaper for a B-25. It cost $12,000, and they acquired that back in 1975. The aircraft had been sitting for several years. So we sent a crew down to Wilmington, Delaware to service the aircraft, get the engines running, get everything up to speed so we could actually ferry the aircraft back. But before we did that, they filled the bomb bay doors up with watermelons. And when they got back to Hamilton, they did a low and over the runway and opened the bomb bay doors, and all these watermelons went splat on the runway. And to the chagrin of the airport manager, because he had to close the runway down after that because all these seagulls gathered to eat up all the watermelons.
The museum's B-25, a fighter bomber, is one of the planes that you can purchase a ticket for a thrilling ride. As Backroad Museums crisscrosses the country, visiting smaller and unique museums, there is one constant. They would never survive without the dedication of the many volunteers, and the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum is no exception.
We couldn't operate this place without the people, the volunteers we have in the museum. They don't get a lot of recognition, unfortunately, But boy, I'll tell you, they are the frontline personnel.
As a volunteer, I get to fly the airplanes. The other volunteers I work with are the fellas that put the fuel and oil in this aircraft, wash it and keep it clean, check the tire pressures. They do everything here. Basically, we do about 60,000 hours of volunteer work here. As our boss says, if we had to pay him $10 an hour, we'd have to shut down the museum in a day.
We have approximately 300 active volunteers in our museum. They are the heartbeat of our museum. They're the only reason we still exist. And that's the reason the museum has grown to where it is over the years, is the core of volunteers that put all their time and effort into this organization.
Now we got the tour guides on the volunteer side. We have the pilots on the volunteer side. Without the pilot volunteers, we wouldn't be able to fly these aircraft around.
And that's why I came here to this museum. They needed pilots, and I was flying the Harvard at the time, and I've never looked back. I've been flying this airplane for 25 years now.
They come in here as a very experienced pilot. Many of them are ex-military, many of them are airline pilots, and then they work their way up from the Chipmunk training aircraft, move up to the Harvard, and then they go up to some of the twin aircraft like the Dakota, and then they transition into the Lancaster. No different than during the war. That's how they would go through the process.
Getting up close to any of the 47 aircraft is well worth a trip to the museum. One very rare plane stands out as the star of the collection.
Everyone's favorite aircraft is definitely the Lancaster. It's such an iconic aircraft. The four Merlin engines just are so powerful and so loud when you see them fly over. You just can't help but to love that aircraft, considering what it was.
The Avro Lancaster was one of the most effective weapons in the defeat of Nazi Germany. During World War II, over 7,300 were built. Today, only 2 of the 4-engine heavy bombers are still flying. The only one in North America can be found here at the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum. Finding, fixing, and flying the museum's rarest plane was a long process.
Back in 1976, we were just a fledgling organization. We had a handful of aircraft, and 2 of our members noted that there was a Lancaster on a pedestal up in Goderich.
And I never dreamed that it would fly again. It was a static display. But our volunteers went up there and dismantled that airplane in the middle of the winter and brought it back here.
It took volunteers 11 years to restore that aircraft. Many of them were World War II veterans.
Of the over 7,300 Avro Lancaster bombers made during World War II, about 50% were lost during the war. So the question must be asked, why are there only 2 in existence that are still flying?
That's a good question. Probably the cost of operating these aircraft is significant. The one in England that flies is still operated by the Royal Air Force and is paid by the Royal Air Force. I think we were the only other foolish people who decided that we'd like to fly a Lancaster.
I mean, the most expensive part of keeping these airplanes going, especially on the Lancaster, are the engines. It's well over $100,000 US to get one of these things rebuilt. And when they're taken off, we send them out to Vintage 12 in California.
This one weighs 1,400 pounds, burns 1,000 liters an hour in cruise. During takeoff, we're getting almost 600 spark plugs firing per second. And it's ingesting the volume of a double-decker bus a second. If you can picture the volume of a double-decker bus, I mean, it's significant.
Of the thousands of missions flown by Lancaster bombers, one could be considered, if not the most daring, the most famous. May 1943. Operation Chastise, better known today as the Dam Busters, is in full operation. Their mission is to destroy 4 hydroelectric dams in the Ruhr Valley, deep in the heart of Germany. 19 Lancaster bombers, loaded with a special ordnance dubbed the Bouncing Bomb, took off from England. That night, the aircraft had to fly 18 meters above the ground at an airspeed of 390 kilometers an hour. 2 major dams were hit and damaged, but at the cost of 8 aircraft and the lives of 53 airmen.
We never forget what Lancaster was built for, but it also had a different role. It brought war brides home, and it fed the starving Dutch towards the end of the war.
If you are lucky enough to be able to purchase a once-in-a-lifetime ride on the Lancaster, here's what you can expect.
On the Lancaster, it's about 50 minutes in the air, so we'll take off out of this airport, fly over the museum. We like to treat the people that didn't go flying, and head then over towards Niagara Falls. We go up to 3,500 feet around a couple times, then across the lake over to Toronto, and then back down the shoreline. And basically what we're trying to do is present the noise to as many people as we can, get them looking up. You hear it coming. It's that beautiful sound, and it changes as it goes past. It's not business class seating. As you know, we don't have a washroom on it. There's no in-flight service, but we do have a lot of fun, and we bring them up two at a time into the cockpit area so they can stand up and look out, especially over the falls. We've had passengers, they can't talk because they've got a lump in their throat, and that might be because of relatives that were on the airplane or that were lost on the airplane, or for some of the passengers, it's quite emotional. It can bring back memories.
When getting an up-close look at the Lancaster, you can't help but admire the courage and bravery the 7-man crew had to endure during their missions. Bomber Command suffered the highest casualty rate of any branch of the British service in World War II.
They were all young, 150,000 of them in Bomber Command. 50,000 didn't come back, by the way. 10,695 were Canadians. That's significant losses. Taking off at night, every position would be filled. The gunners, nose gunner would be there, tail gunner, turret gunner on the top, because it was wartime skies in England. There were marauders flying around waiting to catch these bombers, especially in your takeoff mode, where you're full of bombs and you're slow and you're heavy. They know that they're a target. The metal on these airplanes doesn't stop a bullet. And all you needed was for one stray bullet to hit a bomb, or your fuel tank, or a pitch control on your propeller. So many things that could have gone wrong. Very few of them made 100 missions. Believe it or not, out of all of those airplanes, only 30 of them made 100 missions. It's hard to believe, isn't it?
The museum's Lancaster is dedicated to a Canadian airman who posthumously won the Victoria Cross, the highest and most prestigious award in the British honors system.
This is the Andrew Mynarski Memorial Lancaster. Andrew Mynarski was in that turret over Cambrai, France, and his best friend, Pat Brophy, stuck in the tail gun position, and he can't move his tail gun to access his parachute, which is inside the airplane. And Andrew goes back in the fire and tries to cut him out of the turret. He was Andrew's roommate and friend. When Andrew couldn't get Pat clear out of the airplane, he just stood and saluted at the door. And how do we know that? Because Pat Brophy survived. He rode that airplane down on fire, nobody else in the airplane but him. And he said one moment he was at 18,000 feet and being chased by a fighter, and the next minute he's rolling around in the dew of a grass field in France. Well, what if he'd hit a town, come down in a town, or hit buildings in the water or whatever? When this airplane was restored and flown for the first time, 6 of the 7 original crew members were here. Andrew Mynarski was buried in France.
Coming up next on Backroad Museums.
Okay, guys, enough talk about this. What do you say we grab all our bodies here and get on board this airplane and go for a ride?
Backroad Museums is visiting the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum in Mount Hope, Ontario. The museum is unique because visitors can purchase rides on some of the most iconic World War II planes, including a seat on one of only 2 operational Lancaster bombers. Of the 47 military aircraft on display, one has a storied history, the Douglas Dakota.
That aircraft is the unique aircraft in our collection, as it's the only aircraft that saw combat history.
The only war vet we have in the museum. She started her life with 233 Squadron with the RAF, and that was taking the British paratroopers over to Normandy on the 5th and 6th of June. And that was her first big mission.
At 2200 hours, on the night of June 5th, Operation Codename Tonga begins, part of the larger-scale Operation Overload, better known as D-Day. 239 Douglas Dakotas transport the 3rd and 5th Parachute Brigades. During Operation Tonga, over 8,000 men were deployed into German-occupied France.
Once D-Day was all over with, she became very, very busy in the European theater. Repatriating prisoners of war, she was carrying wounded back. This bird alone carried over 100 tons of cargo on the missions that she flew with 437. If it wasn't for these transport aircraft bringing in all the supplies, the fighters wouldn't have been able to do much because they wouldn't have had the ammunition, number one, or the fuel. So yeah, they played a very, very important role during the war with these transport machines.
Our Dakota, we were very lucky to receive that one. It was operated by the government after it was retired from the Royal Canadian Air Force. We just put in our application to acquire the aircraft, and I think there's probably a little politics behind the scenes, but we were lucky to get that donated to us.
Before the flight, the museum's ground crew performs a pre-flight check of the plane.
Well, we have to check the oil, check the fuel, check for water in the gasoline, check all the connections and the flight surfaces, and the nav lights and beacons.
When we turn the propellers prior to a flight, it's to avoid an oil lock in the cylinders, because a startup under those circumstances would cause a lot of damage.
She took men to war, and it's an honor to work on her and keep her flying.
Okay guys, enough talk about this. What do you say we grab all our bodies here and get on board this airplane and go for a ride?
On the way.
If you purchase a ticket on the museum's Dakota, you can't help but wonder what the young aircrew and paratroopers thought before they took off on D-Day.
Hell, I'll tell you, it would be extremely stressful. Just picture yourself at 20 years old, knowing that you're going to be taking these paratroopers into Germany, and it's not going to be a cakewalk. The C-47 has no armament on it whatsoever. So your job would to get these guys in, get them out of the aircraft, get turned around and get home without getting shot down. So it would have been extremely, extremely stressful. Maybe they just took it a little bit better than an older type would. They would be flying low and slow. They would be somewhere in the area of 100 knots. Just one big target out there for anti-aircraft guns to just take shots at. So that's what would make it very, very stressful on the cruise. A lot of people really don't have a grasp of what went on during World War II, what it took to win the war type of thing, what aircraft played a big part in the winning of the war. That's why we give them a real front row seat as far as seeing them here.
While riding in the Dakota, you get a true sense of the commitment and bravery of the air crews and paratroopers. If you are a fan of history or aviation, a flight on any of the museum's World War II planes is a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Coming up on Backroad Museums is a sneak peek at some upcoming episodes. The Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum is a classic example of a smaller museum off the beaten path that allows visitors a unique experience that more prominent metropolitan museums can't provide.
I believe a museum, a smaller museum like ourselves, is important as we can tell different stories to some of the larger museums that are out there. The future for the museum, well, considering all the struggles and challenges we've had over the first 50 years, I think we're in good shape to handle any of those new challenges that come up. We're going to continue to be a flying museum. We may not fly the same aircraft we're flying now. Are we going to be flying a Lancaster when it's 100 years old? No one knows at this point, but we're going to continue doing what we can with the Lancaster and all those aircraft as long as we can, and we may have to adapt at some point.
Visit their website, warplane.com, for information on hours of operation, upcoming events and exhibits, educational programs, booking a flight on a vintage aircraft, donating to the museum, or becoming a volunteer. The Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum in Mount Hope, Ontario is a must for history fans, aviation enthusiasts, and military buffs. On this season of Backroad Museums, we will find out why a small town in Ontario was once called the canoe capital of the world when we visit the Canadian Canoe Museum in Peterborough, Ontario. Why does America's most preeminent Western artist have an upstate New York museum dedicated to him? We answer that question when we visit the Frederick Remington Art Museum in Ogdensburg, New York. We will be visiting the Ontario Regiment Museum in Oshawa, Ontario, whose collection of over 100 military vehicles, including tanks from different countries, is the largest in North America. So join us each week as we explore unique and interactive museums off the beaten path on Backroad Museums.